events. So in other words, this is a classic kind of altered state, and you can see why it's a powerfully personal kind of experience and why it has political impact and economic impact. Can you imagine a drug that allows you to experience, if it's true, to experience what other people are thinking? No more secrets. No more hiding. Basically, there's nothing that can be kept from anyone else. Not that it would become the Borg, all right, of Star Trek fame. But the point is, if this was true, you can imagine this would change the way our societies would interact forever. All right? And you can see why they would be a threat to some. Now, other kinds of... did you ever see what happened? The actual person who... Hoffman, who brought about LSD, discovered LSD in 1943. Hoffman was trying to find a cure for migraine headaches using ergot. Ergot, of course, is the compound made from the fungus of rye. One of the reasons that there were big epidemics of seeing werewolves and all kinds of things during the Middle Ages. People would have contaminated rye bread and hallucinate en masse. But did you ever see his actual statement when he actually got it on his fingers? Well, here's what he said. Last Friday, in the midst of my afternoon work in the laboratory, I had to give up working. I had to go home because I experienced a very peculiar attack of dizziness. At home, I went to bed and got into a not unpleasant state of drunkenness, which was characterized by an extreme stimulating fantasy. When I closed my eyes, the daylight was most unpleasant to me. I experienced fantastic images of an extraordinary plasticity. They were associated with an intense kaleidoscope play of colors. After about 2 hours in this condition, it disappeared. He just got it on his fingers. Can you imagine what would happen if you had a compound you could breathe like that? Incidentally, the idea of manipulating and influencing populations by something in the water supply is not unusual. Do you realize that the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually thought about and had a motion to put Valium, all right, into the water supply of Lebanon during one of the first Lebanon crises in order to minimize aggression? Incidentally, you know about hemp and hashish, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. I've actually had letters from people, let's say, in the Middle East who argue, is there any electromagnetic pattern that you can give me that if someone is taking hashish would incapacitate them? The idea that drugs have political impact as well as personal impact is really one of the greatest challenges, not only to brain and behavior, but to civilizations. Well, what about this one? Marijuana or cannabis. The active ingredient is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and the typical concentration in a marijuana cigarette about 1 to 4% THC. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about what you said about Eliega. Is there anything to indicate that there are drugs out there that would allow us the ability to read other people's thoughts?
Well, there are lots of drugs that, the question is, are lots of drugs out there that can allow us to read people's thoughts? The first thing you would have to do is to differentiate, is it just a subjective experience? Because if you stimulate the amygdala and certain other areas at the same time you have any experience, you'll think it's true. I mean, during the time of stimulations of the temporal lobe, if you stimulate the temporal lobe, people can be listening to a foreign language and think they understand it. All right, because you have to realize the brain is being modified by these drugs. So you'd have to have an external kind of modification as well, or an external kind of verification. The sensibility seeds, 6%. Hashish, you've heard of hashish before, haven't you? Okay, the resin of cannabis flowers, 8 to 14%. Hashish, where have you seen that before? Hashish, of course, comes from the Arabic word meaning assassin. That's right. During the 11th to 13th century, there were a whole group in the Middle East called assassins. They stopped Genghis Khan cold, as well as the Mongols. And of course, by consuming this material, they felt totally immortal, totally super in terms of power and capacity. And you can imagine what it's like if you have someone in your midst who can simply go up and kill you and don't really care. Yeah, basically hashish comes from the word assassin, which means basically hashish eater. Now that's just a way that drugs can be used by political forces, but remember, All you're really doing in either case is modifying what's already in the brain in terms of what is possible. Hashish oil from boiling hashish, hashish crystals, these are various forms. Now, in terms of the effects of THC, most people know, and in fact there's a lot of people who consume it. It's estimated up to 40% of the population your age may have had at least one marijuana cigarette. At least one, as people laugh and chuckle and saying, that's a conservative estimate. And remember, you can predict the effects by knowing what parts of the brain are being stimulated. So, for example, in the small or earlier stages, it's the frontal phenomena, so you get that kind of inebriation effect, which is somewhat similar but not identical to that from ethanol in small dosages. Then you get the synesthesia effect, where you get the effects of feeling music. Sometimes there's a red glow around various kinds of objects. The meaningfulness of visual stimulations increase. People become more sensual. And also, because at higher dosages or after more than 15 minutes, the hypothalamus gets stimulated, something occurs called the marijuana munchies. You heard of the marijuana munchies? Right. If you give people a bunch of small marshmallows, somehow they get almost hyperphagic in nature in terms of consuming various kinds of marshmallows. And I always find it, too, very interesting is that when you have individuals who are like this, they feel like they're very elegant and eloquent when they speak, but objectively, it's a phenomenon that's going on inside the brain. And, of course, there's time distortion. Time often feels like it stops. Now, people have asked me, what is the comparable effects of an ethanol drunk and a marijuana high? Very, very clearly. Compared to the average ethanol drunk, the marijuana high is marginal in terms of performance impairment, which is an interesting problem, isn't it? The typical ethanol drunk is really performance impairing. A comparable marijuana high, if it's impairing at all, is minimal in comparison. That data has been available in the literature for I don't know how long, but people do not want to take a look objectively at the data. Now, what are some of the medical uses of THC? Well, treating glaucoma, for reduction of intraocular pressure, asthma, produces bronchodilation. And remember, tetrahydrocannabinol works because you already have cannabinoid receptors in your brain. Some people actually seem to make this compound themselves. All right. In fact, some individuals actually get better when they smoke marijuana or take THC because normally they're fuzzy, but when they consume it, and these are usually heavy guys with a lot of corticosteroids, a lot of cortisol. When they take this compound, they actually got more focused. I think one of the interesting features is that you have to know the pattern of the brain activity. Did you realize that one of the greatest causes of mental retardation is ethanol consumption during pregnancy? Produces the fetal alcoholic syndrome or the fetal alcoholic disorder. The area of the brain that is impaired, which is frontal, right orbital frontal in particular, in fetal alcoholic syndrome, which means they have more difficulty, these individuals have more difficulty interacting with their peers, following social rules and so forth, as one of the reasons they're involved with the criminal system so often. That the drug that would reverse the effect that has produced an appropriate stimulation, in this case, would be THC. Now, isn't that an interesting contradiction? In order to reverse something from one drug, another drug is required. That is also well known in the literature. Okay, you can also use THC for treating nausea. And again, THC is an anti-emetic from chemotherapy, and it can be used to treat some types of epileptic seizures. Some types of epileptic seizures. And of course, the purity is critical. And there are many kinds of complex partial seizures that are appropriately treated by THC. The advantage, of course, the side effects are minimal. Now, again, this is not to say that psychotropics should be abused. They are like any other tool. They're only as proficient and as dangerous as the person using it, and as knowledgeable as the person using it. Well, in terms of specific features of marijuana in the 1980s, 70% of adults between ages of 27 and 32 had used THC. Tolerance develops with chronic high quantity exposure. Of course, as I mentioned before, the effects are short-term but not long-term memory deficits.